Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Dan Green, I'm the Head of Solutions at Jumpsec.
And I'm Tom Elson, the Head of Offensive Security at Jumpsec.
We're here to speak to you about attack surface mapping in action. Attack surface mapping is something we've been speaking about a lot recently, and we covered it at our previous briefing event. Since then, our capability has matured and the engagements we've delivered have increased in scale and sophistication, taking what was a concept to quite a practical solution. We wanted to talk to you about a particularly interesting project that we delivered recently. The objectives of the project was to provide a non-judgmental view of both security successes and improvement opportunities across the shared attack surface of 9 organisations. This was a very exciting project for us because it gave us the ability to review a huge amount of data for a number of similar organisations in terms of both maturity and business operations. So the way that the project worked was that there was a hypothesis-driven brief that was set to us by the organisations. So I want to extract 2 of the key statements here. First and foremost, to equip organisations with intelligence and insights beyond those can be generated from monitoring only their own systems and threat sources, to prevent and respond to cybersecurity threats rapidly and effectively. And secondly, if we accept that we have vulnerabilities all the time, how do we find them and close them quickly? Now, we perhaps reflect on this second statement here. One of the primary objectives was getting the most out of the security budget of the organisations who participated. In the current climate that we're in at the moment, where security budgets are being stretched and there are fewer resources to throw at security problems, finding and resolving the issues with a material impact on security is paramount. So, in reflection, we'd probably consider it's not about closing everything, but rather knowing where to invest your resources to maximise that risk reduction. To put it in simple terms, if you can't fix everything, how do you know what is important enough to fix? So we settled on attack surface mapping as the approach. Now, attack surface mapping is an increasingly common term in the industry, but with varying interpretations. So if your definition differs, we're not saying you're wrong, but this is what we're talking about here today. So for us, the attack surface is the culmination of an organisation's internet-facing footprint, including but not limited to people, services, data and infrastructure. And crucially for us, it's not just the infrastructure that you directly own and control. Really, it's any information that can be gathered about your organisation over the internet that can be leveraged by an attacker to cause harm to your business. Now, we chose this approach because it addresses a number of gaps in current best practice approaches, specifically in automated vulnerability scanning and typical penetration testing projects that look at a subset of the assets that you deem to be critical and exhaustively identify vulnerabilities within that scope. We see it as a compromise between the wide and shallow of vulnerability scanning and the deep and narrow of penetration testing. And there are really 3 key features that underline this. First and foremost, the project was unconstrained, and that means we're not limiting ourselves to a specific scope of assets, or even just the assets that you know about. Secondly, human-driven. Whilst automated approaches are continuously improving, we still feel today that a human-driven approach is the truest representation of attacker behaviour in the wild. We wanted to validate the findings and also not limit ourselves to scan data, which, as you know, is rich in false positives. Thirdly, it was highly scalable. So despite the similarities in the organisations that we were working with here, they had a very different technology landscape. Simply, they were using different technologies to deliver very similar services and operations. So it had to be able to deliver insight despite those differences. So ultimately, the project was designed to think and act like a real-world attacker in order to identify exploitable issues, not just surface-level vulnerability. And this enabled us to focus specifically on the issues that an attacker could leverage to cause harm. And that reduces a lot of the noise that can come with traditional approaches.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about interpretation of attack surface. Now, I've had varying conversations with various different individuals of organisations around what constitutes and is included in an attack surface. We put together this diagram here which depicts perhaps what you as an organisation would see as your attack surface, and then also what an attacker would see when looking at your organisation externally. You can see in the blue box here we've included things like external VPN services, SaaS services, cloud services, things that you perhaps already have inside your inventorization or asset management solution. From an attacker's perspective, however, it's much more broad. I'm going to pull out a couple of examples from within the red box here and talk a little bit about, for example, Git repositories. Now, I've spoken with organisations who have centrally managed Git repositories for their CI and CDI pipelines, but we've seen instances in the wild whereby organisations have third parties or core employees that are posting code that relates to the organization, to their personal GitHub accounts. Now this falls out the remit of visibility in terms of the organization and what's being posted there. And in some cases, it's secrets that could be leveraged by attackers to access that organizational data. Another example is exposed RDP, which is often overlooked by even some mature organizations. Sometimes it's a requirement for a third party or a vendor to leave that service open so that they can access the infrastructure. Sometimes it's just an oversight and an over-permissive access to a service. And sometimes it comes down to a convenience and sort of, the pandemic's hit us, so we needed to spin up quick access to an environment. We've left it there. It's now convenient, and changing that would cause us a very big headache. In terms of attack surface, this obviously leaves a multitude of gaps that potentially could be leveraged by an attacker.
So, what did we find over the course of the project? Now, the first thing to note here is that the attack surface appears far worse without assessing exploitability. So there were many vulnerabilities identified across the external footprint here. Working with a number of organisations, it's only natural that a large number of vulnerabilities were identified. And of that number, 66% could be classified as medium severity or above when using things like CVSS. And therefore, under a typical model, would probably be enrolled into your vulnerability management system for remediation. But we didn't want to stop there, as one of the key aims, as we said, was to reduce noise by eliminating those false positives and drill down into the most exploitable and leverageable issues. We distilled that down to 15% that could be deemed to be potentially exploitable. And that was done through a number of methods, through deduplication, for example, but also through leveraging our understanding of what attackers are actively exploiting in the wild and which vulnerabilities there exists exploit code for, and also which are typically overlooked in your other routine security assurance activities. So they informed the test cases for the exercise. After executing those test cases, we identified that only 3% could be exploited practically as part of an attack. And further, fewer than 1% could be classified as critical and therefore required urgent remediation. So what we can see here is that the big picture appears far worse than the reality. As one of the key aims was to reduce noise and eliminate the false positives, this clearly illustrates that the aims of the project were achieved. And naturally, this minimised the overheads on the participants in terms of the human and financial cost of vulnerability remediation. So to delve further into the findings, this graph illustrates really that medium level issues were the most prevalent and generally the most impactful. And that's because, going back to the things that Tom mentioned earlier, they typically unlocked other areas of the attack surface. So things like information disclosure or exposed secrets allowed us to delve beyond the initial attack surface and unlock areas that were hidden from more automated techniques. When we compare this to the relatively low number of reoccurring high-risk issues, that's probably because those types of issue are well managed through your other routine activities. Naturally, unless an asset represents shadow IT and therefore hasn't been enrolled in your vulnerability management program, it's likely that you address those high-risk issues as a matter of priority. On the other hand, medium-level issues, because they can't be directly exploited and often have to be chained with other issues, can be overlooked and deprioritised. I'm going to hand over to Tom to talk about some of the exploits that we've observed in the wild that informed this work.
Thank you very much, Dan. So on this slide, we put together a number of CVEs that will look fairly familiar to anybody listening to this. And these are some that I pulled out, some of the most exploited, some of the most prevalent, and some of the most impactful in terms of vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild. I'm going to dig into a couple and talk a little bit about them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Go Anywhere MFT exploit, and a little bit akin to what Dan was mentioning about CVSS. The CVSS score for the Go Anywhere MFT exploit sits at 7.2. Now, it's been widely known that a threat group, Cloth, have been exploiting over 130 organisations using such exploit. Now, whilst CVSS 7.2 is still considered high, in contrast with something like Zero Logon, which is a CVSS 10, that specific exploit requires steps that have to be already taken in order to get to a position where you'll be able to exploit that service. For example, access to an internal network, a phished user, or a compromised service that would give you access to the port that's required in order to facilitate or leverage that exploit. Put together an attack path here. This attack path specifically relates to an APT group who have exploited an external service using and leveraging credentials that they'd found on Stack, akin to what I mentioned earlier. Those credentials were leveraged, they accessed the remote management service, and it gave them access to the internal network. From that point, they were able to leverage a misconfiguration within Active Directory and forge a ticket for a privileged user hence giving them access to privileged services. We also observed in that attack path a state of abusing weak credential hygiene, so passwords that were weak, that the threat actor was able to leverage to get into a position of privilege and hence achieve their goal. This second attack path here takes a bit of a different stance. This is more of a cloud native attack path. So this threat actor is specifically targeting cloud environments that perhaps had vulnerabilities inside of them that they were able to leverage to escalate privileges or laterally move through the cloud environment or get to a position where they were able to access personally identifiable data or sensitive data. Now, this is quite interesting because this stemmed away from the traditional approach of compromising organizations' internal networks and then leveraging and traversing through an Active Directory environment, for example. This specific threat actor was able to leak credentials that they're able to use to leverage services that DevOps engineers were using to access EC2s and S3 buckets, for example, within AWS. Now, this makes detection opportunities quite sparse in the sense that these services are used day in, day out by those same DevOps engineers to access services to perform their business as usual activity. We saw an instance of a threat group using these credentials to access those EC2 services. And that gave them a level of privilege that already they were able to access the S3 buckets that they were trying to get to and exfiltrate that data from the environment. Negating the requirement for them to go anywhere near the traditional Active Directory environment and the traditional internal network, so to speak. So these sorts of attacks and these sort of threat actors that are targeting those cloud native environments, perhaps in some regards, don't even need to take as many steps as they would in a traditional Active Directory environment.
Cool. So we've extracted a few of the useful trends that are perhaps applicable to more organisations outside of those that we directly assessed in the exercise. So first and foremost, the number of truly exploitable issues was found to be far fewer than the total number of vulnerabilities comprising the attack surface. And that really reinforces the importance of assessing exploitability. This naturally meant, as a result of the exercise, that the remediation effort for the participants was much lower than with the typical security assurance approach. Secondly, objectively lower risk issues were repeatedly found to be exploitable, which indicates a potential blind spot. So we would recommend that all organisations consider how they prioritise and score, potentially overlooked vulnerabilities, particularly those in the objectively medium category, as to how they can be applied in context to actually cause harm and disruption. And thirdly, as Tom alluded to, cloud environments presented a robust internal attack surface, whereas traditional on-premise environments presented a higher risk. And this naturally represents the risk of treating the perimeter as a security boundary. We found that when we were able to establish a foothold on those environments, whether as a result of the test cases operated earlier or as a case of de-chaining and beginning the exercise from a foothold, it was much easier to escalate privileges, move laterally, and achieve further compromise of information or resources beyond that what could be initially accessed. So finally, I just want to leave you with a few closing thoughts and questions to ask yourselves in order to ascertain the risk posed by your attack surface. So first and foremost, which third parties present the greatest risk to you if compromised? So is it a case of the data that they store, or is it a case of the operational impact were they to be disrupted? Secondly, what intelligence can be gathered about your organisation externally? Third, which vulnerabilities have you potentially risk accepted that might be exploitable? So is it worth reconsidering some of the prior testing that you've performed and perhaps reprioritising some of the issues you've identified previously? Fourthly, where does your data reside? Do you have control? So harken back to the third party issue there. Are you working with organisations who are processing yours or your customers' data, but you don't have any real direct control or say in the security measures that they're applying? And finally, if your perimeter is breached in a specific area, how far could an attacker get? Which controls exist to limit the blast radius of a potential compromise and prevent the further compromise of information or resources? So thanks very much for listening. We really appreciate you taking the time. We hope that this talk has underlined the importance of understanding your attack surface and giving you some ideas as to how this approach can be used in tandem with other security assurance activities.